here. This is, I don't know, the 4th or 5th event on U.S.-Cuba relations and the reform process, especially in the context of the December 17th measures by the U.S. and Cuban authorities. And we will continue doing that to keep kind of abreast of what's happening and have a sense of direction and what various people are doing, various actors are doing. We have a panel today with 3 presenters, main presenters. Mark Sullivan, who is a specialist from the Library of Congress, and he will be first. Mark is going to be discussing the kind of changing context and content of constraints on the so-called definitions of the embargo rule vis-a-vis the regulations governing relations between the Cuba and the U.S. as far as U.S. authorities are concerned. So then we will have Carlos Fernandez Avalli, Altamirano, a lot of names there. And we thank you for being here. He's from Cuba, and he's an entrepreneur, and he's also an academic. And he's very able to articulate a lot of issues of interest to all of us. So we thank you for being here and coming all the way from, in this case, Miami. And then we have Mauricio González-Corzo. You know him, he's a professor at Lehman College, economics, and he's an affiliate of the Bildner Center, and he's one of the most active members of our staff in terms of what we do here. So we welcome you all. And we are going to proceed. We want to thank the staff of the Bildner Center, Natalia and Rosalina and Miguel and all the others. Can we give them a round of applause because they work very hard. They are the ones who really, and Elba, they are the ones who really make possible for this event to take place in the way they do, which is usually well organized. Usually, we'll see today. I'm going to present, just as we know, something that no one I did not expect. Some people actually did expect this, and I was invited to meetings, but which I was too busy finishing a book, did not go to those meetings. But something happened drastically on December 17. Miguel, what happened here? You failed me again. No, I have it. And, well, I already mentioned that the reform process, this is the background. In 2008, actually the beginning of the story is really 2008. The more I think about this, Raul Castro becomes president of Cuba, Obama gets elected and makes statements. And then there are kind of low-grade interactions, essentially. By 2013, President Obama authorizes high-level conversations, and he designates, mind you, White House staff or aides, Benjamin Rhodes and Ricardo Zúñiga, for the task of negotiating with Cuba. It's not the Department of State, it's the White House, which is interesting. And that's a question that it needs to be clarified. And then they start meeting. There are a year and a half of meetings between June and December of 2014, 13-14. Pope Francis is part of the process, hosts a final meeting in October 2014. A lot of these meetings happen in Canada, but there is a meeting, I think, in the Vatican. And then December 16th, phone conversation, December 16th, the announcement. A lot of things happened since then. I'm not going to bore you with details. Meetings start to take place between the two representatives, the two leaders of the two teams, Josefina Vidal on the Cuban side, and Roberto Jacobson on the U.S. side. And they meet starting on this date in Cuba, and then there are other meetings, 4 or 5 meetings since then. The Summit of the Americas, a big kind of event. Many of us still cannot believe this photograph of the summit, the handshake, and then the meetings between them. And then just jumping into this month, August 14th, Secretary of State Kerry visits Cuba and meets with Bruno Rodriguez and the authorities in Cuba, and is kind of a raising of the flag of the U.S. Embassy, completing a process of not only of opening embassies in both places. So normalization moved very rapidly, and then as some expected, not all, and there was a lot of support for this. Cuban Americans had a 60 plus. This has grown in the last few months or weeks. Catholic Church, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Agricultural Interest Business, Human Rights Watch, Democratic senators and governors, and then in trade and business, Republicans. So there's a kind of broadening alliance in favor or constituency in support of this process of normalization, which gives ground for optimism as to the process and what may happen next. There's opposition, as we all know. So the core of the opposition is from the 3 Cuban members of the U.S. Senate, which is an amazing feat that Cuba, a small island, would have 3 senators out of 100. So that's 3%, or actually that's 6% of the states, since there are 2 senators per state, right? So 6% of the states are represented by Cuban Americans, and yeah, that's correct. And plus 5, and then they are, you know who they are, Marco Rubio. They are all highly educated individuals, the usual immigrant story. They fit well with the American and the story of poor immigrants rising and becoming members of the mainstream. For reasons that we don't have time to clarify, they evolved toward very strong positions on this issue, and they oppose it together with others. All right, let's move on. But nevertheless, I would say on balance, this side here has made and continues to make a lot of progress, but we still have to see what happens when the election cycle in the U.S. heats up. Why did the Cubans do it? Well, the Cuban economy not doing very well in 2014. It's done better in 15, but still Venezuela collapsed. Low price for oil and other commodities, and ill-fated search for oil in Cuba. So there are economic reasons, and as well as geopolitical reasons. Cuba is left a lot more alone than before, and in need of partners or solutions to address its economic issues. There's also resistance or opposition within Cuba to the statist model of socialism, and many people increasing in favor of reforms. And we will hear more of that more about that in a few minutes. And then you have generational issues in Cuba or problem. Or Fidel's 89, he turned 89 August 13th or something? Is that correct? August 13th? Raul is 83, but neither of them is a kid anymore, and neither are the other members of the historic leadership of the revolutionary system process. So Cuba has an age transition to implement, which is not fully in place. A lot of issues to deal with, and I think that's part of the reason why, as a matter of national interest, they are going toward this rapprochement process with the U.S., and I don't have time for the interest of the U.S. Maybe Mark will do some of that in just a second. So there's a whole new chapter. There's a political timetable that is important in 2015 and 16. 2016, there will be elections in the U.S. There will be also the 7th Congress of the Communist Party of Cuba, which is just a few months away, April of 2016. And presumably, Raul Castro will also resign or stop being president in 2018. So a lot will need to happen between now and within the next few months. I'm having problems with it. Okay, there we go. So the near future will be decisive, and that's why we are here today, to assess the current moment and take a kind of a reading of where things are heading. So we're going to be focusing on reforms and economic development in Cuba, which we think is essential in both sides' calculations. But then the question is democracy and human rights. We may not have time for that today. We promise we will do this in a serious way in the future. And then there's a role of the rest of the Americas, of the regional context. This month is going to be very interesting, so we should do maybe an event on this series every month. The Pope is going to be going to Cuba. Well, the bilateral committee or steering committee, if you will be on the normalization process. Will be taking over in a few days or weeks in Cuba, I believe. There's a meeting. Pope Francis will visit on the 19th, and then he will come to the U.S. That will merit a lot of attention and discussion. And then again, the Communist Party of Cuba, these are some of the issues that he promised. He wants to deepen the reforms, kind of a decentralization in at least 2 ways, and there are other issues that they want to be raised there at that point. And of course, as we pointed out, we have the elections in the U.S. So that's just a very brief review, if you will, of what has happened thus far. I left out a lot. We can raise questions about what I left, and then we can return to them and discuss them. But since it's Friday and we have to use time well and wisely, because some of you may want to go and enjoy in Manhattan around 6 o'clock or so, we want to move on to Mark Sullivan. We want to welcome him from Washington. Mark.
Oh, great. I'm going to be talking. Thanks, Mauricio, very much.
Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. I mean, I was here 6 years ago.
6 years.
Yeah. I was, when you asked me to do this, I was like, gosh, I remember speaking. Do I still have the talk? So I actually had the speech of when I was here 6 years ago. It was in June of 2009, so it was just a few months into the Obama administration. And some of the sanctions had started to change then, but boy, has a lot happened recently, a lot of changes. So it's a real pleasure. Thank you for bringing me here today. I'm going to talk about sanctions. I'm going to give you a little bit of a historical background, then tell you how the sanctions have changed with the administration's change in policy, and then kind of looking ahead. Just as a disclaimer, I work for the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress, but I'm not speaking for them. I'm speaking for myself, just in case I say anything stupid. It's me. If you can't hear me, just put your hand up because I'm somewhat soft-spoken. But let me start providing just an overview of the sanctions. Of course, U.S. policy toward Cuba since the early 1960s has basically been trying to isolate Cuba through economic sanctions. At the same time, emerged over time another policy, and that was support for the Cuban people. So that included things like government broadcasting, U.S. government-sponsored broadcasting, radio and TV Marti, the democracy and human rights programs. Also, remittances to Cuba could be seen in that vein, and also purposeful travel, people-to-people travel. But let me start specifically with the sanctions. It'll be a quick historical overview. I won't. If you start to glaze over, I'll go a little more quickly. But the embargo, well, first off, there was a provision in the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 that authorized the president to impose embargo on Cuba. And so President Kennedy in February of '62 proclaimed the embargo. He used that authority of that provision in the Foreign Assistance Act. A couple months later, after he originally proclaimed it, he also cited the Trading with the Enemy Act, and that's as a legal authority for the embargo. So those two acts are the fundamental underpinnings of the embargo. The Trading with the Enemy Act dates back to 1917, and it was basically a way for us to deal with national emergencies and gave president authority to put sanctions on other countries. In 1963, the embargo was broadened to include not just trade, but all financial transactions. And that's when the Cuban Assets Control Regulations were first issued by the Treasury Department, and they remain the fundamental embargo regulations today, the Cuban Assets Control Regulations, often referred to as the CACR. And those regulations also require that anything exported to Cuba has to be licensed by the Department of commerce. So there's a link between the CACR and then the export administration regulations. So oftentimes when people talk about the embargo regulations, they might be meaning both the CACR and then the export administration regulations. So it's basically Treasury Department and Commerce. So flash ahead to 1982, when Cuba was added to the so-called State Sponsors of Terrorism list, pursuant to a provision in the Export Administration Act. And for countries that are on the terrorism list, there's a range of economic sanctions that are imposed. But for all intents and purposes, at that time when Cuba was put on the list, it didn't have, it wasn't really significant because there was already a comprehensive embargo in place. Now, Congress has played an important role in shaping policy toward Cuba for years. And let me talk about Congress's role by identifying 3 different pieces of law, which you've probably heard about. But it will show you how it's significant and how they've had a role in shaping sanctions toward Cuba. First is the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992. And I'm just going to focus on the sanctions portions of the legislation. Among the sanctions in the Cuban Democracy Act is one that prohibits U.S. foreign subsidiaries from engaging in trade with Cuba. It also prohibits, except pursuant to a Treasury Department license, prohibits ships from entering the United States to load or unload freight if it's been in Cuba, trading with Cuba during the previous 6 months. The second piece of legislation, this is the one that's probably very familiar, is the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, also referred to as the Libertad Act. Also, I think in years past, they used to refer to it as the Helms-Burton legislation for its authors. It was enacted in the aftermath of Cuba's shoot-down of 2 planes in February of '96. It combines a variety of measures to increase pressure on Cuba through sanctions, and also provides a plan to assist Cuba once it begins the transition to democracy. But in terms of the sanctions, the most important thing is that it codified the Cuban Assets Control Regulations. So that's an important point that's important now in terms of what is the president's authority to lift the embargo. It also sets forth a number of conditions for the lifting of the embargo. There's a whole series of conditions that are set forth, basically democratic conditions, and unless those are met, the embargo wouldn't be lifted. Important to remember, however, that the president still retains authority to change the regulations because the regulations themselves give the president that authority. It might sound a bit confusing, but that's basically how not just this president, but previous presidents have made changes to the embargo by going through the regulatory process and licensing and whatnot and making changes. The third piece of legislation I'd mention is the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act. It's often also referred to as TISRA. That was put into place in 2000, and it essentially allowed U.S. agricultural exports to go to Cuba, but at the same time, it imposed a number of sanctions related to that. So there's no U.S. government financing or allowed, no U.S. government support, and that act also prohibited tourist travel to Cuba. Still important today. So in addition to these acts, Congress enacted numerous other provisions of law over the years that impose sanctions on Cuba, other provisions on trade, foreign aid, support for the international financial institutions. Now, looking at the policy under the Obama administration, in the first 6 years, I would describe policy as essentially continuity with past policy and the beginning of change. For the first 6 years, most economic sanctions were still in place. And at the same time, the administration continued to provide this other element of U.S. policy of support for the Cuban people. So this dual-track policy remained in place. At the same time, however, in 2009 and again later in 2011, the president started taking more action in terms of support for the Cuban people. For example, early in 2009, the president changed the travel regulations to allow all family, to basically lifting all restrictions on family travel and all restrictions on family remittances to Cuba. In 2011, he took further action and he lifted restrictions on some other types of travel. He also brought back the so-called people-to-people educational travel. Now that had begun actually way back under the Clinton administration. It had been curtailed by the Bush administration, so the president brought it back in 2009. In 2009, when the president went to the Summit of the Americas, it really looked like there was going to be a big improvement in relations. The president had said the United States seeks a new beginning with Cuba. But by the year's end, however, Cuba's imprisonment of the USAID subcontractor, Alan Gross, basically put a new obstacle into any improvement in relations. And it wasn't until Gross's release that the U.S. would move forward with this significant policy changes. So flash forward to December 17th, which I think that's a date that's going to go in history, I think, in terms of U.S.-Cuban relations. It was, and I should note, it was just after the adjournment of Congress, the 113th Congress. Perhaps not a coincidence. President Obama then announced major developments in relations. Mauricio was talking about it. You mentioned some of the things. Basically, it was the release of Gross on humanitarian grounds. And then separately, there was a release of a U.S. intelligence asset in Cuba in exchange for 3 of the Cuban intelligence agents that had been imprisoned in the United States. And with those releases, the president then announced this major shift in policy. And the change in policy basically had three big components. One was the restoration of diplomatic relations. 2 was looking at Cuba's position in the state sponsor of terrorism list. And 3 was increasing travel and commerce with Cuba. Let me run through the first 2 of those fairly quickly. And the restoration of diplomatic relations. Relations had been severed in '61 under the Eisenhower administration. Intersections then were established in 1977 under the Carter administration. When the change of policy was announced by the president, they began a series of negotiations and talks between U.S. and Cuban diplomats to reestablish relations. And there were 4 rounds. And on July 1st, the president announced that effective July 20th, the embassies would be reopened. So that's what happened. And as Mauricio mentioned, just a couple of weeks ago today, Secretary of State Kerry was in Havana for the flag-raising ceremony. Now, with while the reestablishment of relations is a foreign policy function controlled by the president, there are a couple of pieces that Congress has. One is that with the power of appropriations, Congress controls funding for the diplomatic facilities in Cuba. And 2, a U.S. ambassador to Cuba requires Senate confirmation. And the administration has indicated that it wouldn't be nominating an ambassador at this time. The second, with regard to the state sponsor of terrorism issue, as I mentioned, Cuba was put on the list in '82 because of its support for guerrilla groups in Latin America. But as part of the policy change, the president directed the Secretary of State to, I'll skip ahead, Mauricio, 5 minutes.
You're doing great.
As part of the change, the president basically directed the Secretary of State to review Cuba's position on the list, guided by the facts and the law. So, as according to the provisions of law, the State Department undertook a review. That was done by early April. The president submitted a report to Congress by April 14th. There are provisions in the law where Congress could have actually blocked it and through a joint resolution of Congress. But the important thing in all this is that no resolutions of disapproval were introduced in Congress. And so because of that, essentially 45 days after the president submitted the report to Congress on May 29th, Cuba came off the terrorism list. In July, the Commerce Department issued the revisions to the Export Administration regulations to reflect that Cuba came off the list. One of the changes is that foreign-made products containing 25% or less U.S. content aren't subject to the Export Administration regulations if they're exported from abroad. This is referred to as the so-called de minimis real value. When Cuba was on the terrorist list, it used to be 10%. It's important to remember, as I mentioned earlier, that for all intents and purposes, Cuba is still subject to the broader embargo. And so many of the sanctions that were in place because of it being on the terrorism list are still there. The third component, and this is the most important in terms of the sanctions, is the increase in travel and commerce toward Cuba. So just like in 2009 and 2011, the president ordered the secretaries of Treasury and Commerce to make changes. And in January, they revised the regulations. There are a whole bunch of areas. I'll mention just a few of them. Like with regard to travel, the revised regulations authorize a general license for the existing 12 categories of permissible travel that's set forth in the regulations. This essentially means that anybody that falls within these categories don't have to apply to the Treasury Department as in the past. And travel agents and airlines are also able to provide services without having to go to Treasury Department for specific licenses. Travelers can bring back up to $400 of goods now from Cuba with no more than $100 in alcohol and tobacco products combined. And travelers can use credit cards in Cuba and debit cards once these services are offered by U.S. companies. Important to remember is that the changes with regard to travel don't allow tourism, which remains prohibited by law. On remittances, there was a big change and increased the amount of what I refer to as non-family remittances or periodic remittances, increased from $500 per quarter to $2,000 per quarter or $8,000 per year. Also, certain remittances to individuals and independent NGOs in Cuba are authorized without limit for certain activities. Trade, there was some big changes in trade. They basically expand the exports of certain goods and services to Cubans' private sector. So I'm sure we'll hear about that perhaps a little bit. This includes certain building materials for private residential construction, goods for use for the private sector Cuban entrepreneurs, and agricultural equipment for small farmers. There's also on telecommunications as well. There were the revised regulations liberalize telecommunication services in many areas and what U.S. companies can do. On financial services also, there were changes. They permit U.S. financial institution to open correspondent bank accounts or correspondent accounts at Cuban financial institutions. So this should make it easier for making payments of cash in advance for agricultural products. I think one thing I didn't mention earlier, it's still, when we're exporting to Cuba, it's still required that we do either cash in advance or financing through third countries. Important to remember that when the president made all these policy changes last December, he acknowledged that he doesn't have the authority to lift the embargo because it's codified into law. But he said that he's interested in working with Congress to lift that. The important thing in all this is to remember that if to lift the embargo, you would basically have to amend or repeal parts of the Libertad Act, the Cuban Democracy Act, and the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act. So there's still a lot that has to be done. In So I've been working for Congress for many years, and so the shift in policy triggered great interest in Congress on both sides of the aisle. Some members, or not both sides of the aisle, both sides of the policy, because it's not necessarily a Democratic Republican. Some members were really supportive of it, and as being in the best interest of the United States, while others have criticized it criticized the president for not obtaining more concessions, particularly on human rights. So already this Congress, there have been lots of hearings, and there are going to be more hearings will be held, and there have been lots of bills introduced on both sides of the issue. There's lots of freestanding bills that will ease sanctions. Some would lift the embargo totally. Some kind of target travel restrictions. Some target U.S. agricultural export restrictions. Some look at telecommunications. In addition to these bills, this is significant. The Senate version of the fiscal year 16 financial services appropriations bills actually has provisions that would ease sanctions on Cuba, lifting all travel restrictions, lifting restrictions on financing for ag exports and for shipping. In contrast to all those things that would ease sanctions, on the other side of the policy debate, there are lots of freestanding bills, and there are lots of appropriation bills. Most significantly in the House is 5 appropriation bills that would basically try to block some of the administration's actions related to air travel, related to ferry service, and all that stuff. In the end, because of the different opinions in Congress, basically the outlook for any of these pieces of legislation is that nothing's really going to happen this year. So if anything's going to happen in terms of changing sanctions, it's going to come from the administration. And it'll happen by either the administration, again, going forward and making changes to the regulations. The president could do that. They could also, instead of revising the regulations, they could issue some clarification and guidance about what the regulations mean to try to help U.S. businesses or people trying to navigate what the regulations are. But one last thing is that ultimately, the broader lifting of the embargo is going to be in the hands of Congress until they remove some of these legislative restrictions, particularly on travel restrictions. It's a decision that Congress has to make at the end. So thanks, Mauricio.
Thank you, Mark. I will allow 2 minutes of clarifications, of comments, or short comments or questions. John McAuliffe.
Two questions. Mark, if the president does not sign the Trading with the Enemy Act, as he has to do September or October, what's the consequence? Because I've heard interpreted both ways. The second, what is the mechanism that creates all the difficulty for the Cubans using dollars internationally? And is that within the president's capacity to and under executive authority?
What was your second question again?
The prohibitions on Cuba using dollars
Abroad.
internationally
Right.
suddenly emerged in the Bush administration, I think. And I don't know what the legal basis is and whether but that's to the Cubans, that's one of the most aggravating aspects. And it's
The extraterritorial, yeah.
penalty on dollars you
Because of that, right. I think that's in the president's authority to do that. I'm not positive. I've seen that recommended. There are a number of recommendations of that are out there about what the president could or should do, and that's one of them I've seen. On the TWIA, on whether every year it should back up. So the Trading with the Enemy Act is actually kind of expired, and so Cuba is the only country that still is under sanctions under that law because Congress overhauled the whole sanctions regime back in 1977. So because it was grandfathered in, basically every year, I believe in September, they have to renew the sanctions through that. and I've heard that, John, in a number of years, going back a good number of years, why doesn't the president just not do that? I don't think that would have any effect because it was codified. So the regulations are still going to be in place, and there are all these other statutory provisions as well, aside from the regulations. So I don't think that. But, come September, watch, I'll be surprised.
So the State Department argues that the president has more authority to use his discretion as long as TWIA exists. And ironically, if he doesn't extend it, then he has less leverage over everything.
Yeah, but the president was when he made the announcement in December, he basically said the embargo remains in place, and it's up to Congress to remove the embargo.
We'll return to these questions and many others at the end of the session presentations. Mark, I have one question for you, though. What is the most authoritative single source on current U.S. policies, norms governing relations with Cuba? And I know your office puts out one, or you help author, right? An issue came out in June 15th. Could you tell us what a little bit about
Publication?
Yeah, well, there's a report that you put out, and then what else? What else can we go to find out what the latest, if you will?
Yeah, we put out our publications aren't made public unless members of Congress release them, but some other departments put our reports up. I have a number of Cuba reports where I track legislation. The last one I did was at the end of July. End of July, kind of tracking legislation, and I have colleagues that have looked at the.
These are documents what are they titled? If people want to search in the web, or
Cuba issues for the 114th Congress.
Cuba issues for the 114th.
Yeah, I think if you Google that, it actually.
So you're expecting some changes in the near future because of the presidential authority process.
If someone wanted to know about kind of policy and how the regulations have changed, I would recommend two places. Look at the Treasury Department's website. If you just Google Cuba sanctions, it's the first thing that comes up. They have a frequently asked questions guide, which is about 30 pages in English about what the regulations mean for all these different areas. Same thing with Commerce Department. There's a lot of questions with regarding what does this mean, the regulations. Commerce Department has an excellent website as well, where they answer all that. And what does it mean for U.S. business?
Later in the program, we'll get to the questions of travel liberalization. We're going to talk in progress about flights, but let's save that for later, and as well as remittances. There's some confusion actually among Cuban Americans as to exactly how much can be sent, whether it's 2,000 every 3 months or more. So let's save this for later, and we'll go back to, I'm sure you have your own list of questions. Y ahora, desde Cuba, de La Habana, tenemos a nuestro amigo Carlos Fernández, que va a hablar sobre una empresa, his own business, which is Empresas Purita, ¿no? He invented a process of dehydrating garlic in Cuba and then packaging and then distributing it. And he's doing reasonably well. And he hopes to be part of the exchange with the U.S., trade with the U.S. at some point in the not too distant future. It's actually a very interesting product, and you can go to the web and check it out. Purita, no? Sazonpurita.com. Sazon Purita. So it's a very interesting concept, and that's what he came to the U.S. in this trip to address issues about entrepreneurship. So what do you want to tell us about your own? And we are now shifting to our reform process in Cuba. We will make the connections before the program is over. So you want to tell us about what is happening in Cuba, Carlos, especially in reference to your own project?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me here, Mauricio. It's very nice. Right, so the things I want to talk to you about very quickly, I want to lay out a bit, give you an idea of where is things going in terms of the Cuban entrepreneurial environment, some of the key understandings, what do you want to make sure you take into account to start up a business in Cuba, why is food dehydration important? Like, why are we here talking about Industrias Purita? And a bit about the case study, what we did that worked and what have been the setbacks that we have found. So I want to start by, by one idea, and I think it's a very meaningful idea. And it's probably the idea that will connect the United States and Cuba in the strongest way, okay? And it's the fact that Cuba is that red dot. We are the only country in the planet that has an ecological footprint below the world's regeneration capacity, and at the same time have a high human development index, okay? And I'm just gonna leave that idea with you. It's not that we are saints, but definitely this is the case even today, okay? So, what's Cuba's entrepreneurial environment like? Right, so we're a poor country with a small GDP, and in contrast, we have a service economy. So 70% of our income is made up of the export of professional services, 39%, and 31% is coming from tourism in the island, all right? So at the same time, you have a highly qualified workforce, about 1 million university professionals, and the rest of the workforce has at least 12th grade education or vocational education. And our biggest challenge today, you know, sometimes you hear President Raul Castro in television and says we need to substitute imports. He's actually talking about the consumer goods trades imbalance. Okay, and the consumer goods trade imbalance is in the order of 5,000 million US dollars. And our imports, we have an open economy because of this, and our imports are 41% energy and 17% food, right? There's a connection between the energy industry and the food industry, okay? And the two very interesting spaces where you should, where Cubans and Cuba should be promoting the focus of their entrepreneurs, all right? At the same time, Cuba has a poor logistics performance index. This has to do with transport, with packaging, with how do you get things around, how do you connect to the international markets. That's well below the mean performance index and makes the entrepreneurial environment very difficult in Cuba. And then you have this phenomena which is created by the double currency and the different ways in which people act economically in Cuba, where you have the 5 different markets and 2 currencies to deal with. And in each of the markets, the currencies have different purchasing power parities. Okay, so it's extremely difficult to construct a price in Cuba. Right, just gonna go through those a bit. The pesos market here has, so you have the rations, which is basically the ration market, and that accounts for about 40% of people's diets. You got the dollar, the CUC stores, so the dollar equivalent stores. Then you got a pesos market, which is sort of supply and demand. Is a fixed price market, but is not subsidized. Okay. Then you have the non-state sector, which then has a completely different pricing and works in both currencies. So in these stores, now in Terredes, you can buy with pesos. Okay. In CUC stores, you can buy with pesos at a 1 to 25 conversion rate. So that's one of the measures that have been taken to try to bring the gap between the currencies together. But anyhow, it's an extremely complex scenario. And today there is legal framework in place for the non-state sector and for the cooperatives. And this legal framework in general promotes entrepreneurship. That's, you know, I've done some studying, and in general, it promotes entrepreneurship. Evidently, it's a very rustic system. It needs a lot of tweaking to make the appropriate incentives to drive entrepreneurs in the right directions and to move away from discretional aid provided by local governments for and started this into actual policies that promote entrepreneurship strongly from all the directions of the government. So at the moment, there is a will to help the entrepreneurs, but this will, the strength of this will is not translated adequately into the law. Okay? So, but this will move forward. And there's sources of funding. There is multiple funding bodies in Cuba. One is the bank, the Metropolitan Bank, actually has set aside, the government put together a fund, a fiduciary fund to support with very soft loans the new entrepreneurs, both, especially the non-agricultural cooperatives. Okay, so the bank will support with about 4,000 CUCs, so 80,000 Cuban pesos, más o menos. They will support the cuenta propista sector. So if you want to set up a cafeteria, well, you can find a little pot of money to do that with. You want to build a room to be able to rent, you can find a little pot of money to do that with in the bank. And you have to be able to back it up with someone. So someone else has to say, here's the 4,000 CUCs, lock them up in an account so that as an entrepreneur, the bank can free you up the money. And so that's how that works. But the interest rates are very soft. They're in the order, they fluctuate between 4% to 8% in the worst of cases. And it depends on the duration of the loan. So the expectation for non-agricultural cooperatives is that they're turning around their loans within a year's time frame. We thought we could do it. It was a silly idea. You'll hear about it later, because it's very difficult to turn around a business in a year's time. Okay, very, very difficult. And but this is the expectation anyhow. So, but some people are already asking loans in the order of the 30 million Cuban pesos and more, and that's already $1 million. Okay, and the government has created the provisions in a government backing to give the bank the security to give out these loans. There's another source of funding which is accessible for legal personas, which is the local development municipal initiatives. Yes, and each province has an allocated set of funds. In the case of Havana, it's about 20 million CUCs. Okay, but this is a very cumbersome process to access this money, right? So people are not really using this fund, but it exists, it's there. Okay, right. So taking all of that into account, how you set up a business idea in Cuba? What do you do? Well, where do you push? And basically, there's 4 ways to start a business in Cuba, a private business, so a non-state sector business. One is you start, you take a license and you do a cuenta propista business. You're self-employed, which is not really self-employed because you can employ people to do it, and you're tax-free up to 5 people. And you can migrate your state-run business into a cooperative structure, okay? Which in most cases is the ministries who are saying this team will migrate and this business will migrate. So I don't know if there's many proposals coming from the base to the ministries, but the idea is to remove the burden of having to administrate from the government apparatus cafeterias and hairdressing shops and whatever. It makes a lot of sense. And this is an open leasing process. So basically the people that are working there don't get it straight out. They have to demonstrate that they're going to do a good job, and there should be open competition. What ends up happening is that usually the people that have worked in these places for 20 years, they get the first go at it, basically. And you can start a cooperative from the non-state sector, so you can convince your local government that you have a good idea and that they should support you. And then you have, this one has 10 levels of approval, this one has 11 levels of approval. Okay, but you go, you know, get on the pedal your way up the ladder, and you get there. And that's what we did. We went Cuenta Propista first, and then went and convinced our local government and made it all the way through the 11 levels of approval, right? And then we got a loan from the bank for 985,000 Cuban pesos. So there you go. And the other way is a foreign company. So today the foreign investment law allows investors even to do 100% foreign investments in Cuba. Okay, and this process here is simpler than what we guys in Cuba get, but it takes more time. So you have to be trading with Cuba with contracts in a contractual basis for 3 years with a trade margin above 500,000, so $500,000. So you have to turn around business over $500,000 a year for 3 years before you're allowed to open a representation in Havana. But it's not impossible to do. If you want to fast track that, then you want to go into Mariel Special Development Zone, which has other advantages like 8 years of tax-free haven. You have an income tax haven for 8 years. You have licenses to import and export things in and out of the country, and you don't pay, customs taxes when you're working in Mariel. So there's huge advantages about working in Mariel, and it's worth considering. Then, so you remember our logistics index, 2.07? So you want to keep it simple, okay? Now, in Cuba, it's a service economy. People are accustomed to delivering and working in a service environment. Not really, there's not really many provisions for doing production to produce consumer goods, okay? You can find in Cuba pretty much small amounts of pretty much anything you can imagine. The problem is when you have to find lots of things, lots of one thing that is very cheap, okay? So you can buy garlic, oregano, yeah, but if you want 600 tons of garlic to process, you don't get it, okay? You got to start all the way at the bottom with the fields, and you got to convince the farmers to work harder, and that's difficult, okay? Because they work pretty hard already, and it's a question of technological availability and logistics, and accessing the real possibilities to deliver, and so they'll refuse to sign the contracts, and this becomes a nightmare. So you want to minimize the number of things in your supply chain as much as possible. If you design a business with the minimal amount of things in your supply chain, you have the largest possibility of success, okay? And if you can add added value by putting a service on top of it, or making it an art product, for example, or a souvenir, then your chances of success increase, right? You don't have access to the typical marketing schemes that we're all accustomed to. So there isn't a Havana Times Square. And so you have to do guerrilla marketing. And there's a very famous example, which is La Pachanga. This is a cafeteria. And they actually went to the 1st of July, the Labor Day marcha. I'm missing the word, I'm sorry. They went to Labor Day March, yeah? And they took a sign, Cuenta Propistas are here with the big La Pachanga. Grandma takes a picture. Everybody in the country knows they exist. Okay? So these are the sort of strategies that entrepreneurs in Cuba are having to follow to get noticed. Okay? Now there's more formal processes in the informal market, like El Paquete, which is basically satellite TV in a flashcard that gets passed around, and it's free to advertise your stuff in the Paquete. Yeah? And there's other spaces. There is already a classified, so there's already a government company that is doing classified advertisements, so that it's a magazine with productions, and then there is also the Yellow Pages allow for Cuenta Propistas to participate. So there is options, but the most effective ones are usually guerrilla type marketing schemes. And where are people doing things? Well, entertainment, catering, and hospitality, consumer goods and constructions. This is where the most successful businesses are happening today, because there are high value added businesses with low input of resources, you know, and construction doesn't seem that way, but it's the case. Construction is a highly technical, one-time type of business. Okay, so you have small clients, you can pre-establish very well what you need, you have a long time frame to find it, and that kind of stuff. So some of the biggest cooperatives are actually in construction at the moment. And well, you know, everybody's talking about the Cuban economy being a state economy. Yes, that's right, the biggest amount of the GDP, so the non-state sector, cuenta propista sector is accounting for about 7% of the GDP, but actually if you look at the structure already of the Cuban economy, you got 8,000 agricultural cooperatives to 6,000 state enterprises, and that was already a couple of years ago before this reform. Now we have 350, so we have 477, there's 1,000 missing there, I'm sorry, 477,000 new enterprises being born in Cuba, okay? So that makes that number look small. And some of these businesses are not small. Some of these businesses are turning around $1, $2, $3 million a year, okay? Some even greater than that. These cooperatives, the agricultural cooperatives, the millionaires that have been identified in Cuba are all members of agricultural cooperatives, many of them in the south of Havana, and they have fortunes in 10s, 20s, and 30s of $1 million or more, okay? So there's money around in Cuba. It's about 30 to 40% of the GDP of Cuba is actually circulating around, so that's about 25,000 million US dollars in the streets. Okay, so the problem is one of our biggest challenges is how you make that capital start reinvesting itself, you know, and powering up the non-state sector and the state sector, because I believe in the mixed economy model, for example. Now, so today it's really a far-fetched statement to say that the Cuban economy is a state economy. You know, it just depends how you're looking at it. Just give it a bit of time and you'll see what happens. Okay, now, import substitution initiatives. Well, whatever you do, you get more support from everybody if you're addressing this problem. Okay, so you want to make sure that you set up a business that instead, and for those in the US that want to do business with Cuba, think about it. So try to set up a business that instead of getting Cuba to buy something from you, you put money into Cuba by providing a service of some sort or an import substitution, or you manufacture in Cuba something that you can sell elsewhere. Okay, and these are the things that are going to happen quicker. Okay, so if you look at the non-agricultural cooperatives, what is the distribution? Well, this is, se acabó. Un minuto, perfecto. If you look at the non-agricultural cooperatives, this is the distribution, and just wanted to say that 70% of the cooperatives are in the service sector, in the retail sector. So what is happening with the cooperative is actually consistent with the open economy model, and that's the proportion there. We created Purita in 2012, and our vision is sustainable, high-tech agricultural businesses, okay, to address the markets in the south of the United States and elsewhere. And I think Cuba is very uniquely positioned to do that because we got sun, land, water, intelligence. Okay. So what went well? We tried to start a very large garlic production. We couldn't do it, so we diversified. We developed 14 different products, and that worked well. Okay, that's our current manufacturing capacity. And we designed an attractive business idea that did substitution of imports. All spices in Cuba are imported. We had a spice farm, small agricultural facility that we could show people so we could get our suppliers to be convinced that it's worthwhile doing it because they could see it. We used Cuban engineering, so this is our plant here. We went from here to here. And what actually made the biggest amount of money for us was doing the engineering. You know, we grew up our company and capitalized our company the fastest by not by buying the equipment, but by actually designing and getting the equipment and making it happen. And then we have had a long time getting to the retail stores, but we're there now. And we didn't try to change the world. We tried to understand everybody's needs and try to accommodate them somehow. So we spent a lot of time making friends and building alliances. And that has worked very well for us. Okay, what went back? What went wrong? Cuba has a very difficult work culture because people are just miseducated through the lack of incentives of many years. So it's very difficult to get people involved and going. We designed a speed to the market that didn't work. Okay, we thought we were going to be able to use the law as it was. Well, nah. There's a lot of discretionality still within the system, so that was very difficult. You have to be 25 times better than your competitors. So the guys that are importing spices, they're working with exchange rates of 1 to 1. So they're driving their cars at 1 Cuban peso to 1 CUC exchange rate, when we have to pay 25 pesos for every liter of petrol, right? So you really have to be very efficient to fight with your competitors. Cost estimation and price fluctuations just gives you this idea. The garlic changes up to 5,000% in price within the year, from the time of season to the time of maximum value. Access to the market was slow. The economy is disconnected nationally and internationally, which means the entrepreneurial process is slow, and therefore you run into cash shortages. It's very difficult to design how much is it really going to cost, because all the uncertainty of the system makes it very difficult to estimate how long it's going to take, right? So that's where we are now, and these are the conclusions. And we think sustainable is the way forward, and we should produce food, and with the waste of the food production, we should produce energy and attack the, 57% of the trade imbalance barrier. Cuba has natural resources to solve more than half of that problem. Thank you.
Gracias, Carlos. Carlos is negotiating with Mario to set up a company, a trading company. So maybe next year we'll have Sazón Purita in New York. Carlos, I have 2 questions for you. Very fast answers, please. What's between you and Mariel, number 1? Why are you not what would have to happen for you to operate at the Mariel scale, which is the last epitome of your scale? And 2, what can happen, what should happen in terms of U.S.-Cuba relations so that people like you would have a better chance of making the jump to Mariel and elsewhere?
Okay, so
very fast, we'll go back to those issues.
Yeah, right. To get to Mariel, well, we need 2 things. One is we need the system to be less discretional, so we need authorities in Cuba to be less afraid of making the first decisions. Okay, so because if you are in the forefront, like we've been all the time, you're always just getting hurt, all the time, bam, 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 hitting against barriers. So that's one thing that needs to change in order to climb up to there quickly. The other thing is you need cash.
Cash.
Yeah, you need money.
Financing.
Okay, so so that answers exactly the other question. Is if you can link up the financial capital of the United States, especially of the Cuban Americans in the United States, yeah, with these enterprises in Cuba, and don't go garlic, go the technology. We've designed a whole manufacturing technology that works with solar energy. It's like, so actually what I'm telling people all the time is you need to put money behind Cuban ideas for Cuba that can also be taken elsewhere. And you need to connect these Cubans with American universities and with American businessmen that believe in technology businesses.
We'll go back to some of those issues and other related questions after the third presentation. I'd like to just remind all of us that we are actually launching 2 volumes. We have them there on the table, right? Which we will hope you stay and will help us have a brindis as a celebration of the two volumes that we publish in to kind of assist to promote contact with Cuban scholars, innovators, and like Carlos and others. And those 2 volumes reflect reforms in the reform process in agriculture, Mario, and also in general reform process, right, and other conditions. So we'll have some exhibitions and some volumes, and you can, there's information where you can go if you wish to acquire them. And in any case, we want to celebrate that process and that project, and we will have something to drink. That is some spirits.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending. First of all, I want to thank the Bildner Center and Mauricio and the staff of the Bildner Center for organizing this event so so early into the fall semester here at CUNY, and we're very glad with the turnout that we got, which reflects your interest in the topics that we are presenting here at the Bildner Center. My presentation is sort of a follow-up in a sense. This is the second time that Carlos and I coincide in the same panel, and it was sort of randomly selected that he would present first because, in essence, my presentation aims to provide a theoretical framework to help us understand many of the main points that he made in his presentation. So I'll talk about I'll begin by presenting you a profile. I'm going to move out there too, if I can not see the screen or anything like that, but a profile of self-employed workers in Cuba. When we talk about cuentapropistas, de qué estamos hablando, who are these people, where do they come from, and so on. And then I'll talk a little bit about the entrepreneurship in other post-socialist economies, and I'll clarify what I mean by that concept. And then I'll try to conclude with some potential, maybe applicable lessons for Cuba derived from some of those experiences. So that's the essence of my presentation. So I was doing some research about the trabajadores por cuenta propia, cuentapropistas, and basically by the second quarter of 2015, Carlos cited 477,000. That's a more updated number, but by the last quarter, there were around 456,000 self-employed workers. Something that caught my attention is that they now represent about 10% of the economically active population of Cuba. That means that compared to 3% as recent as 2011, okay? So that's a significant growth in their share of the economically active population. Something very interesting too is where are they concentrated for me geographically, for me and for many of us here who want to study Cuba beyond Havana, right? So they're concentrated, but about 2/3 are concentrated mainly in Havana, Artemisa, Mayabeque, and so on. Matanzas, Villa Clara, my home province, which is very entrepreneurial in agriculture, Camagüey, Holguín, Santiago de Cuba. So there's a concentration. It seems to be that they're pretty spread out throughout the country. Something else just to piggyback on what Carlos was presenting is, and I think he made a point that I'd like to sort of follow up on here, which is that these are activities that you see here, the principal activities and occupations, are activities that are low cost, relatively low startup cost, and also relatively low risk also. And very, in comparison to other functions, these require very small levels of what we economists like to call working capital. So you see food, sales and production, eso en español es servicio gastronómico, about 13%, transportation, it includes freight transportation and passengers. So think about people that not only the fancy taxis, the refurbished American cars in Havana, but people in the interior of the country who have a horse-drawn carriage, un carretón, and they're moving goods and people around and so on. So that's around 11% or 12.5%. Residential and leasing and renting, I'm not surprised that it's pretty close to 7% because of the state of the housing infrastructure in Cuba, and of course there's a housing crisis. So it would be almost impossible to see that kind of activity representing a high percentage. Also, that's the kind of self-employment activity that requires quite a lot of capital. You know, if you look at purchasing a home in Cuba, or somebody owns a home and you want to refurbish it to rent it and so on, that would require a significant amount of working capital. But I want to call your attention to the last category, which is around 1/5, around 20% of the self-employed workers are considered to be contract workers. And I think another point that was made before was that these are not really self-employed workers, so we have to be very cognizant of the qualifications, right? So we have micro enterprises that are not so micro anymore in terms of revenue, in terms of sale, particularly because of the flexibilization that has taken place since 2011. Something else that I found interesting was that around 68% or so of the self-employed, the legally registered self-employed workers are considered sin vínculos laborales, previos, without previous employment. So these are apparently people that were part of the hidden unemployment that the Cuban economy has, that seized the opportunity to become self-employed workers. Around 18% are said to be salary workers. I'm assuming that out of that 18%, 80% still work for the state. So we can assume that there's something else which happens here in the United States also, which is the emergence of part-time entrepreneurs, right? Academic part-time entrepreneurs, non-academic part-time entrepreneurs, agricultural part-time entrepreneurs, and so on. But here's another interesting number: about 14% are jubilados, retirees, people who are supplementing their retirement income, which of course in nominal terms is okay, but in real terms is not, by engaging in self-employment. So that's sort of like a statistical profile. I don't have gender, and of course I don't have I couldn't capture the statistics on the number of people who return their licenses or who give up on self-employment. We know in this country the Census Bureau says that around 50% of new businesses fail. The real number is higher than that, but imagine if we assume 50% failure rate in Cuba, then we have a better picture. So
15 or 50?
50.
50.
Yeah, and 50 in this country. Yeah. So my presentation really was not so much about the profile of the self-employed workers, but to present a theoretical framework to understand self-employment. And what I'm referring to here is the transition from classical socialism to regional socialism, not a transition to a free market economy, but more so to a mixed economic model. And so, of course, one of the things that happens is that the elimination of restrictions brings more people to the private sector, okay? And of course, people join the private sector because they're motivated by their ending statement was money. They're motivated by money, by the opportunity to improve the living standards, to get to obtain greater autonomy from the state, but quite frankly, to make more money. So the entrepreneurial class represents for the government, of course, a source of tax revenue. It also contributes to the growth of the economy, job creation, and sometimes improved economic efficiency. Sometimes, not all the time, by the way. There's ample literature showing that in the other stages of transition, efficiency doesn't really improve. And one of the reasons, and this can apply to Cuba, is that many part-time entrepreneurs who work for the government engage in pilfering, and of course, they have no incentive to improve efficiency. Because could you imagine somebody working as a part-time entrepreneur, but also working in a government, in a state-owned enterprise, and now having to face a hard budget constraint in the government, in the state-owned enterprise? That would impact this person's capacity to appropriate themselves from goods, you know, and sell that or use it for his or her business. That's what I'm trying to say. The whole business of moonlighting, this is what I referred to when I cited a statistic about the percentage of people who work for the government but moonlight and so on. The numbers are higher. We all know the numbers are higher than the official legal employment. These are the official legal employment numbers. And so the final point about these characteristics is that they operate under the shadow of the state. Carlos mentioned the 10 and 11 procedures that are required to form some kind of enterprise and so on, and that's one example of that. The strong regulatory framework is also an example of that, and of course the relationship with the state is full of contradictions and back and forth and so on. That comes from this classical literature on entrepreneurship under the transitional phase of socialism. Okay, so Entrepreneurs, what I wanted to show you here, in the interest of time, I'll go really quick, is they're no different under the transitional phase than they are in a free market economy. You know, they're go-getters, they're people who are able to adopt, people who are reliant, self-reliant, they want to create a new order, they want to make a lot of money, they want to seize opportunities and so on. They're risk takers and everything that we know. They maximize utility and maximize profitability. Of course, I have to say that because I'm an economist, but that means I think everybody understands that they're very similar to the entrepreneurs in a capitalist economy. The contributions, the most significant one is job creation. And I think we can see that in Cuba, and we can see that formally and informally. If you travel to Cuba, you can see the multiplier effect in terms of job creation. I was in Cuba not too long ago, and I talked to people, as I like to talk to people here and everywhere that I go. Yeah, the multiplier effect of job creation. But job creation comes from novel enterprising firms, new companies that are created, not state companies that are transformed into efficient capitalist companies, but novel enterprises, newly created forms. Economic growth, yes, they contribute to economic growth, particularly by meeting the demands for population for goods and services and so on. So I'll move on. Barriers, he talked about some of the barriers. One barrier that really doesn't really apply to Cuba is the entrepreneurial tradition. That one doesn't really apply to Cuba. Cuba does have an entrepreneurial tradition. Even after the revolutionary offensive of 1968, the entrepreneurial spirit, I think you saw that before, and you see it, particularly if you travel to Cuba, is there, has been there, will continue to be there. But the second barrier does apply to Cuba. A hostile business environment, an environment where the state doesn't provide sufficient support services. I'm not saying that it doesn't provide any. What I'm saying is that it doesn't provide enough sufficient services to expand entrepreneurship. Also, a primitive financial system. I know Cuba has made headway in terms of financing, but there's a lot more to be done. And regulatory framework, inadequate access to financial resources. Here I talk about credit, commercial loans, but also the equity market. Right? There isn't venture capitalism that I know of that's permitted, that's legal. You know, you mentioned access, connecting the capital markets, right? So venture capital would be one way to do that, right? Or opening, I don't know, the regulatory framework for more venture capital. That is a constraint that they currently face, and Carlos attested to that. Insufficient quality, availability of qualified workers, limited access to equipment, facilities, and of course, delayed payments by clients, delayed payments by the state, low purchasing power, and so on. Skill-based barriers, informal barriers during the transition period. I think the skill-based Cuba could easily jump that, right, with some access to technology and so on. Cuba has a highly educated workforce. Cuban, we have a very strong entrepreneurial spirit. The proximity to the United States, the proximity with our community here in the United States will nourish that entrepreneurial spirit. But, so I'm not so concerned about the skill-based barriers. Those will be overcome in a few years. You see it, by the way, when you look at people who migrate from Cuba here, and they don't know how to use a computer, or they're not up to date, let's say, and 3-4 years later, they're running a business, and they're experts in running businesses and so on. So, entrepreneurs, kind of entrepreneurs, agricultural entrepreneurs, individuals who operate in the informal economy. Of course, number 3, people who were members of the official structures who now become entrepreneurs, professional entrepreneurs. I'm speaking of professors, architects, lawyers, and so on, that become entrepreneurs. I could foresee, for instance, people becoming academic entrepreneurs, which is not a bad thing, which is what I sort of do here on the side. But don't tell CUNY. Entrepreneurial spirit, strategies, prospecting is what Carlos mentioned, which is sort of like trying to find a niche, trying to find something that isn't there, that's not available. Or, by the way, it's also what you said about Pachanga, you know, prospecting, positioning themselves so people know, are aware of their presence. Networking, of course, happens everywhere. It's not just an entrepreneurial spirit, it's just a basic business strategy. But number 3 is important. Number 3, the blurring of private and public boundaries, right? So, talked about turning a state enterprise into a cooperative and sort of blurring little by little, you know, making that into a non-state entity, That's a very strong entrepreneurial spirit, considering the number of state-owned enterprises in the Cuban economy. I think number 3 is something that will significantly expand. So let's see where we are. So from the literature on entrepreneurial experiences and so on, what are some of the lessons for Cuba? Well, here I talk about Cuba's emerging entrepreneurial sector. I'll skip over that. I just want to point to the bullets at the bottom, which are some of the challenges that Cuban entrepreneurs, and not only entrepreneurs, but cooperativas no agrícolas, including, by the way, economic joint ventures face some of these challenges. And these are the problem with the input markets. Of course, from an entrepreneurial perspective, the government's monopoly over trade inputs and exports and many sectors of the Cuban economy, that creates a constraint, no doubt about that. If you're a private entrepreneur, if you're a cuenta propia, trabajo por cuenta propia, as far as I know, and I have talked to people and I have done informal surveys and all that, they cannot form legally joint ventures. I understand that people from here, like myself, I could send money to my relatives, we could set up a business under the table and all that, but legally we're not allowed to do it. Okay, so that's a major constraint. Restrictions on property rights that limit the concentration of wealth. I'm referring to restrictions concerning real property, tangible property, never mind intangible property. Cuba is not there yet in terms of intangible assets, right? But even in terms of intangible assets, you couldn't say, well, I'm going to borrow money from the government up to $1 million or 80,000 pesos or whatever, and I'm going to use that as collateral to borrow more money from a private lender. It doesn't exist. Okay, so that's a constraint. High taxes, business environment. The one down here mentioned on a report by Richard Feinberg, I found that very interesting, the scarcity of suitable retail spaces, and this is very true. The government is trying, and this is a very positive thing, to lease, to create this lease arrangement with former employees of state enterprises in some activities, but the problem is not that there is a willpower there, but there isn't the infrastructure to do it. And it's pretty scary when someone says to you, you could lease the space, but you have to upgrade it. And by the way, you don't have the working capital. You have insufficient working capital. A primitive and financial and banking system, I think Carlos also alluded to that, and perhaps not using the word primitive, but limited banking system. So, what are some of the experiences? I know I have a minute. I see Mauricio getting up. What are some of the experiences that we can sort of grab from the literature? And I think Cuba is very unique. We all know that. I'm Cuban, so I like to think that. We believe that. We convince ourselves of that. But I think private enterprises, and I read between the lines in the lineamientos and so on, and private enterprises provide positive externalities as a result of the experimental, innovative, and adaptive nature. I'm going to expand on that and say, well, and they also capitalize on the inherent entrepreneurial spirit of the Cuban people. They offer an alternative employment, source of employment, particularly when the transition to a mixed economy speeds up and you have more layoffs in the state sector, and you have all these highly qualified people that cannot find work. Well, there's a source for that. They contribute to a more rational utilization of the country's human capital, whatever that means. I know what that means, but creating opportunities for people to use the human capital better. And of course, finally, and I'll finish here, they meet the increasing consumer demand for more goods, for more services, for riding better cars and so forth. And I'll leave you with a couple of questions. Two questions, and I promise I'll shut down. First question is it compatible, is the expansion of the private sector compatible with the premise of sustainable socialism, which is the official line followed by the Cuban government? And the second question is, to what degree then is the leadership, the current and the forthcoming leadership in Cuba, whoever that is, willing and able to make concessions to allow the private sector to do more? Thank you.